Hi, I'm Marianne Williamson, and thank you for joining with me on the podcast. A few months ago, my daughter had flown back home to London. And when she got there, she called me and she said, Mommy, you have to read this book called The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis. She said, it's unbelievable. I read it on the plane. I couldn't stop reading it. You have to go get it immediately. Michael Lewis, I said, the same Michael Lewis who wrote the book that The Big Short was based on? She said, yeah, it's the same guy. I had heard of him. I knew he had written Moneyball. I knew that he had written The Blind Side. And I loved The Big Short. I loved the way it explained the economic crisis of 2008 in a way that I had not really understood before. But because my daughter told me to go get the fifth risk, I did, just on her recommendation. And that book blew my mind. That book explained things to me that I hadn't understood before, not really, and explained things to me that seemed to me to be so key to what not only was going wrong in the Trump administration, but what needed to be made right once the Trump administration was over. In 1980, Ronald Reagan became president, and one of his most famous lines was that the most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." He began this process of demonizing government, really making people think that everything the government did was wrong, everything the government did was inefficient, everything the government did was inept. And in fact, not everything the government does is inefficient or inept. In ways that most people don't realize, government agencies are doing things every single day that keep the roads safe and keep airplanes safe and keep cars safe and keep food safe and keep water safe. And in many ways, some of the ways in which we are protected, whether it has to do with disease, whether it has to do with health, whether it has to do with anything else. The government's job is to advocate for the safety and the well-being of the people when there are other interests that would actually undercut our good. Many years ago, I was speaking in a congressman's office in Washington, D.C., and a young staffer came up to me and he said, I had talked about the importance of safety regulations or health regulations. I talked about the importance of the fact that agencies should not be dominated by corporate interests. To give you an example, for instance, in the Trump administration, the Environmental Protection Agency has been led by two men. One was an ex-oil company lobbyist and the other an ex-chemical company executive. So you have here the Environmental Protection Agency, which exists in order to fight off any overreach by something like big oil. And what do you have heading the agency now? You have guys who actually represent the interests of big oil and whose entire careers have been spent trying to fight off the work of the EPA. I knew that the agency capture had gone on, had been a kind of creeping problem year after year after year. And when this young man said to me, and this was several years ago, he said to me, but Ms. Williamson, what about our dual advocacy? And I remember looking at him and saying, there is no dual advocacy. You work for the U.S. government. You're not here to advocate for chemical companies or advocate for big agricultural conglomerates. You're not here to advocate for big pharmaceutical companies. You're not here to advocate for health insurance companies. You're not here to advocate for defense contractors. You're here to advocate for the safety, health, and well-being of the American people, of our democracy, and of the earth on which we live. Well, that was several years ago, and things, of course, have only gotten much worse. Now, The Fifth Risk is a book that tells the story, and this is the brilliance of Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis takes all these left brain issues, but he tells us what has gone on in terms of the human story and the human effect on people's lives. So he turns left brain issues into right brain storytelling. That's what makes them so important in our society. So he tells an important story. And that is that when Donald Trump became president, he had absolutely no interest in learning how government operated. Think about government, the U.S. government. You've got 2 million people who are employed by the U.S. government. This is a big ship. So when you turn from one presidential administration to another, it's a big deal to operate that navigation, operate turning it around. When George Bush when his administration handed things over to Barack Obama, he did a very good job at the handover. He had all of the agencies in the executive branch prepare briefing books and give all of the presentations that were necessary to all of the people who would be the incoming administration, who would need to know the data, who would need to know the classified information, who would need to know what was happening so that they could take the baton and take it from there. So when Trump won the presidency, Barack Obama demanded of his administration, we will be as good to the Trump incoming team as the Bush team was to us. And he demanded that all of the agencies in the Trump administration prepare briefing books, prepare presentations, prepare all of the people in such a way that when the incoming Trump people came in to learn, okay, what's going on? What are we going to do? What's the data, etc., they would be able to take it from there. What the fifth risk is about is the fact that the Trump administration didn't really care what had been happening in the U.S. government. As it turned out, Steve Bannon was literal when he said, we're here to deconstruct the administrative state. And in fact, the book is one story after another, where in areas that have to do with our safety, our protection, even including things like nuclear stockpiles, there are all these amazing stories where the Obama officials sat there waiting for the phone call. When are we going to have the meeting? When are we going to brief you guys? I remember early in the Trump administration when Trump himself was not attending the daily intelligence briefings that were given to the president-elect. If you read The Fifth Risk, you definitely were aware of the negligence of the Trump administration. You were aware of the fact that really nobody was watching out for the interests of the American people in agency after agency after agency, as control and power was turned over more and more and more to corporate interests. But now, Trump has been defeated. And so we have an issue on our hands is what are we going to do now? So I wanted to know what Michael Lewis is thinking about now. As it turns out, he's writing a sequel to The Fifth Risk because The Fifth Risk was published before the COVID pandemic. So I know I, for one, am very eager to read what he will have to say about how all of this pattern played out in terms of the COVID pandemic. But also I wanted to know his thoughts about how we have to change. One of the ways we have to change, of course, is that we must never take our eyes off the ball again. One of the good things about The Fifth Risk is it explains to you, how does government operate? That's why I'm putting the book up on the screen so you can see it. How does government operate? Because we can't just say, okay, well, Trump's not president anymore and we've elected Biden and he's had experience in government, so we can all relax now. No, we can't. We have to become educated citizens. We have to know what's going on. We have to watch what's going on. And we have to remember who's the boss here. Here's my interview with Michael Lewis. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. In 1980, Ronald Reagan became president, and one of his most famous lines was that the most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." He began this process of demonizing government, really making people think that everything the government did was wrong, everything the government did was inefficient, everything the government did was inept. And in fact, not everything the government does is inefficient or inept. In ways that most people don't realize, government agencies are doing things every single day that keep the roads safe and keep airplanes safe and keep cars safe and keep food safe and keep water safe. And in many ways, some of the ways in which we are protected, whether it has to do with disease, whether it has to do with health, whether it has to do with anything else. The government's job is to advocate for the safety and the well-being of the people when there are other interests that would actually undercut our good. Michael Lewis, thank you so much for being here with me. I'm honored to have you on the podcast.
Total pleasure. I've been waiting for you to ask.
Before you came on today, we talked about the psychological relationship, the emotional orientation that people have with the U.S. government, and the ambivalence that dominates so much of that today. Starting with Ronald Reagan having demonized the government in people's eyes, really. And when your book came along, the Washington Post said that it was a love letter to federal employees. And one of the lines that you have in the book is, we don't celebrate the accomplishments of government employees that exist in our society to take the blame. So this book shows us who they really are. What do you think? What in your mind is the healthy relationship between the citizens of this country and the federal employees, the U.S. government? And what is it that it seems to you people don't understand about the work of federal employees in the government?
So I'd say it's what I didn't understand. What got me into this in the first place was I didn't understand what it meant when Trump fired his entire transition team the day after he was elected. And when Steve Bannon stood up and made a big show of burning or throwing away all these books that the Obama administration had prepared for them in order to make for transition to occur smoothly. And I didn't have any particular predisposition towards the government or its employees. I went in asking, all right, what does it mean that we're basically not going to have a transition? And then found things like it means that someone is sitting in the Department of Energy waiting to explain to the Trump incoming administration how the nuclear arsenal works, and no one ever gets that briefing. And the fifth risk is me setting off on a journey to figure out the answer to the question, what does it mean? And to me, it meant two things. One was that the federal government can be framed in lots of different ways. But the least, it seems to me, contentious way to frame it is as a manager of a portfolio of risks that we all face, and many of them existential risk, whether it's the climate, or it's the risk of nuclear war, or it's the risk of a pandemic. That a lot of these risks find their home for the management of them in the government. And if you don't take that management seriously, all of a sudden it seems a lot scarier than it otherwise would be. But in the course of the second thing that this sort of journey led me to was just who these people were who were managing the risk. And it was extraordinary. I was expecting to find, I don't know what I was expecting to find, but what I wasn't expecting to find were heroes, people who could make a lot more money in the private sector doing something a lot less important.
Right.
And who had instead said to themselves, this is important. This is it. The society needs this. I'm going to go do it. And we ought to talk about a couple of examples just to drive it home. But the general picture was of a collection of very mission-driven people who were continuing to try to do their mission as best they could, not because of the society, but in spite of the society, because society really did nothing but heap kind of scorn and derision upon them, and that they were, they were in a work environment that no private enterprise could survive with. That very little upside. They certainly didn't get paid. If they got noticed, it was usually a bad thing. If their names were in the newspaper, it was a bad thing. It was for a bad thing. Inherently had a sense of, having to move through their lives in a kind of defensive crouch because the world was looking for them to screw up rather than appreciating what it was they actually did. And how do we get in this situation? I think there's a short answer to that question, and how we can end up tolerating what the world that Ronald Reagan kind of started has created. And the short answer is, up for a long time, we've lived through a period of by historical standards, extraordinary peace and prosperity. Yes, there are these little local wars overseas. Most of our society is not implicated. Yes, there's poverty in America, but it is the most prosperous society that feels unthreatened on the face of the earth, and is really there are not a lot of historical precedents for this, so we have the luxury of ignoring what these people do until now, right? Until something bad happens, and I think that's kind of at the bottom of it. You can afford to trash these people as long as you don't really need them.
Well, people just have taken for granted that these people were doing their job, even though at the same time, because Reagan had said the most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm the government and I'm here to help you," people became vulnerable to this lie that the government was inept at everything that it did. When in fact, so much of what we take for granted that does work is because of ways in which government agencies have not been inept.
Right. In spite of incredible disadvantages because of essentially basic mismanagement by us, right? I mean, there are all these little facts that I find just very shocking right now about the government. But one sort of illustrates many, or dramatizes many. That there right now in the United States workforce, there are 5 times as many people working in information technology. Fixing computers, software, over the age of 60 than under the age of 30. Now, think about that. How many people do you know over the age of 60 who even know how to turn their computer on?
That's pretty extraordinary.
No, but you got, and here's what's happened is we haven't hit refresh. That we have not. We've ceased to draw bright young people into the federal workforce, and we're kind of living on borrowed time. And you see all kinds of little accidents that occur because of it. And in addition, that we've constrained the federal government in all kinds of ways because of an instinctive hostility to it. Like it's not really allowed to market itself. So you don't know, for example, that you got saved from that tornado or that hurricane by the National Weather Service. You might think some private company or someone on the television news got you out of the way of the hurricane. There are lots of basic problems that hinder the government's ability to sort of explain what it does.
Well, when you're talking about the weather, you're getting into the specifics of the book. I want to make sure everybody knows we're talking about The Fifth Risk here by the extraordinary Michael Lewis. And going back to this business of the weather and going back to something that you just said, that these agencies are not legally allowed to market themselves. So you don't necessarily recognize all the good that they're doing. But I want to go back historically a little bit. We didn't realize how literally Steve Bannon meant it when he said we want to deconstruct the administrative state. He really did mean. He meant demolish the whole thing.
Yeah.
So what happens in the book is that's and once again, your storytelling makes it come to life, makes it real. So all of these Obama officials and Obama agencies have been good boys and girls. They've planned these presentations that they're going to give to the new Trump administration, and the Trump people in agency after agency never even called.
Right.
Right now, we're talking about how dangerous it is that they are not giving Biden the daily intelligence briefings. But with Trump, there was the Obama administration saying, okay, we're going to start telling you what's really going down. And he was saying, no, I don't want to go. And I remember him saying, they'll tell me if they have any problems. I mean, there were just so many red flags from the very beginning. So there are 3 particular areas in the book where I think the story is so redolent with ways that people can say, oh, I get it. One has to do with the Weather Service, particularly much of what you just said, the relationship between the Weather Service and NOAA and AccuWeather, is it called? Mm-hmm. The other one has to do with the toxic sludge in Washington State. Hello, nuclear waste. And the other has to do with Wilbur Ross. When he goes into the Department of Commerce, and you had already explained that really it should be called science and technology because that's where the U.S. main data is. Wilbur Ross doesn't even get there for 2 weeks or so. He has no entourage with him, nobody even to take notes. And they say, well, actually, Mr. Ross, you probably should know that the main function of the Commerce Department is data storage for the U.S. government. And his response is, no, we're not going to do that.
My interest was attracted in the first place, not by Wilbur Ross, but by Rick Perry. Yes. As you know, as a former presidential candidate, you know what happens on stages. And that he, on a stage during a presidential debate, had said he wanted to eliminate 3 departments of the federal government. Could not remember the names of one of them, at least one of them. And afterwards, he said, "Oh, it was the Department of Energy that he wanted to eliminate." It was, and when Trump appointed him to run the Department of Energy, is when I asked, like, what does that do? If he thought it could be eliminated. And then he got in and he realized that
it's the nuclear arsenal.
It's a nuclear arsenal. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? The material was just almost too good to be true. You couldn't believe that. It took me a little while to get my mind around was that there wasn't some hidden workforce inside the Trump administration that was actually going about understanding all this stuff while Trump was dismissing it. In fact, there was nothing. And that I could go in I started this thing maybe 6 months after Trump was elected, but I could go in a year after he was elected and be the first person to get a briefing about how the Weather Service worked, or about the fact that there is these thousands of square miles in eastern state of Washington, where we created plutonium for the bomb in World War II, that is still a cleanup site of such terrifying magnitude that you really have to kind of see it to believe it. But it's a lunar landscape with people walking around in hazmat suits, and best case it's $3 billion a year for another 50 years to clean it up. And if it's not managed, the nuclear sludge that's below the surface, which was just kind of dumped into the soil, is going to leach, is going to get into the Columbia River and screw up the entire Pacific Northwest. So So in any case, but to me, the malfeasance of Trump, it was just an excuse to write about something deeper, because this is more than just Trump, right? I mean, Trump is that we tolerate this as a society, that no one actually particularly cares whether he shows up for the transition or not. That we tolerate it shows you that the society doesn't understand the role of the government. And think about how strange this is. In what other democracy do the citizens regard their own government as some sort of enemy, as opposed to an expression of themselves, as opposed to the highest expression of themselves? This is how we manage our affairs. This is how we take care of each other. It's how we take care of ourselves. It's only in ours that we have this. It's a neurosis. This odd ideology of, the government's out to get you. And it doesn't survive. That attitude really does not survive actual exposure to the human beings in government who are doing the jobs.
Not only does it not survive exposure to those human beings, it doesn't survive the facts. And of course, the COVID pandemic is a perfect example. We're getting to see what happens when your government is not there to take care of emergencies when emergencies actually happen.
Right.
And it was a well-strategized journey from having a healthy respect for the processes of government to the demonization of government, because, of course, what forces such as the Koch brothers were trying to do was to make you think that government can't handle these things, corporations can handle them better. And so if corporations can handle them better, that leads, of course, to the agency capture, where there's really no point in having somebody run your EPA who's caring about the environment. Bring in some ex-chemical lobbyist or some oil company executives. So the very kinds of corporate entities that these agencies are set up to protect us from, should they overreach with their concerns just for short-term profit, in a way that is a healthy balance between the public good and the ability of these corporations to make money, was completely smashed, and all these corporations took over. And I think that the story of the Weather Service is such a perfect example of that. And if you could tell us a little bit about what is the role of NOAA, what is the role of the Weather Service, and then what happened, what blows my mind about things like the Weather Service, which you see over and over and over again, is that public investment, our money, goes into supporting all of this research and all of this work that has to do with tracking the weather. And then these corporate entities like AccuWeather, they get to come in and make the money off of it, right? They're the ones who get to make a profit off of it. But actually, it was our tax dollars that went, it's like when the congressman says, why do we need the Weather Service? We can just get our information from AccuWeather, because he didn't realize AccuWeather got its money from the Weather Service. Am I right?
Yes. You're speaking faster than I can completely understand, but yes,
I'm so
it's
sorry.
the same language. It's the same language, but you're moving very fast there. So I'm going to slow it down for just a moment.
Okay.
And so this was what happened. I mean, if you think about, we take our weather predictions for granted. We should not. If you go back 30 years, your forecast 2 days out was not as good as your forecast 10 days out is right now. Your ability to know where the hurricane was going to land was nothing like what it is now. Many, many, many lives have been saved, and much commerce has been made possible. The jet you fly on doesn't bounce around as much as it used to, thanks to the National Weather Service. It's been this, and what it's been in part is it's a massive data collection and analysis enterprise, and billions of dollars a year inside of the Department of Commerce. It eats up about half the budget of the Department of Commerce, which is why Wilbur Ross's disinterest in it was particularly curious. It is, yes, it's taxpayer dollars that have funded this massive progress, taxpayer dollars and important relationships with foreign governments, because you can't just have your own data from your own space. You need the data from Europe and from Japan to know what's going on, in the atmosphere. Private companies started to make money off weather predictions. AccuWeather is one of the first. And it was really just taking, in the very beginning, the National Weather Service predictions and gussying them up and putting them in prettier charts and so on and so forth. To this day, all the private weather services are dependent on National Weather Service data for their models. If they don't have that data, they can't give you anything that's particularly useful. What was really disturbing about what happened when Trump was elected was that for years, AccuWeather, which survives off this free flow of information generated by taxpayer dollars, has been fighting to prevent the Weather Service from communicating directly with the American people on the grounds that it ate into AccuWeather's profits. Now, so they didn't want the National Weather Service to have an app. They certainly don't want it advertising its forecasts, so on and so forth. And to the point where Rick Santorum, AccuWeather's in Pennsylvania, Rick Santorum was a Pennsylvania senator, introduced legislation to basically shut down the relationship, the public relationship between our National Weather Service and the American people. So who does Trump appoint to run this enterprise?
The head of
AccuWeather. And now he never actually got confirmed. So God knows, but we know that all kinds of goofy stuff has gone on inside the Weather Service during the Trump administration, including, I don't know if you remember when Trump was circling Alabama with a Sharpie and saying that was the hurricane was going to hit there. And said, actually, the Weather Service, no, it's not going to hit there. And then they had to backtrack and say, maybe the president knows what he's talking. All that stuff. There was even an attempt to politicize the weather. But it was a money grab. And this was one of the strains of what was going on. And when you talk about the corporations taking over this or that and regulatory capture, that was one of the strains of what was going on. Only one of the strains, I think, in Trumpism. But what it does is it completely misses the real story that's there. Who are these people inside the National Weather Service who have been behind such incredible progress that has enriched and saved all of our lives? And these are all people who are kind of trained scientists who could make a lot more money outside the Weather Service. Who, the typical story I would get was, I knew I wanted to work at the Weather Service when I was 10 years old and a tree landed on our house and almost killed my grandmother. And I knew I wanted to find ways during a storm. And I knew I wanted to find ways so that wouldn't happen to other people. And I wanted to help figure out when the weather, what's going to happen in the weather. And so you'd find the people who are there are people who are there for a purpose.
Right.
And that we allow our president to appoint someone who is essentially basically an insult to them while they're trying to do this is unbelievable. It's incredible that we as a people tolerate it. And I just assumed, as I say, I think at the bottom of it all is this sense that we have the luxury of being able to do this, that the minute it becomes a genuine existential threat, nobody's going to say the government's a conspiracy to destroy our lives. Everybody's going to be turning to the government for help. That's what happens. And that maybe now we have such a threat, and maybe now people will relearn sort of what we all need is a civics lesson. like what this thing does and why we need it.
Well, we have 11 states in the United States that don't even require half a year of study in American civics or government or history. And that's, I think, a large part of how so much of this has happened. People people were very vulnerable to the lie that it was just a deep state because they didn't know what the steady state was. They were vulnerable to the lie that it was just a big swamp because they didn't know what the life-giving pool was that they actually needed. And the beauty of your book is what you just said, all the very human stories, the people who also, in the book, it's very clear that when they saw how the Trump administration had bundled this, didn't care, they were genuinely worried for what was going to happen because they knew how important these services were. Max Steyer's comment, people don't understand that bungled transition becomes a bungled presidency. So this whole idea of what a transition is, like you said, people need a civics lesson. People don't really realize that, once again, as you said, the person who had already taken the test was now required by law to help the person who may not have studied for it.
Correct.
So, reading your book, it became very clear how dangerous it was, that the handover to Trump, it wasn't that Obama didn't make the handover to him, wasn't that Bush hadn't made the handover to Obama. It's that the Trump team didn't care. They were there to destroy all that, basically, to deconstruct the state. Now, your book was published before COVID, but the COVID pandemic is a perfect expression of what happened. So, Bush had started the pandemic response team in the government. Then Obama had added to it, and Trump got rid of it. Is that correct?
I think it's a little more complicated, but it's interesting how it's more complicated. So Bush, yes. On the heels of both 9/11 and Katrina, I think Bush all of a sudden became very alive to the possibility of really unlikely bad things happening.
Yeah.
And he read a book about the 1918 swine flu pandemic and freaked, and said, what's our plan if such a thing occurs? And we didn't really have one. So the planning for pandemics starts then, and a plan is created during the Bush administration. The truth is that when Obama came in, they didn't have a particular interest in that plan, but they had themselves it's kind of a faux pandemic, but there was in 2009, there was a swine flu that infected a huge number of Americans, maybe as many as like 80 million Americans. And in the beginning, it looked like it was going to be lethal, very beginning. And if it had been lethal, we would have had 1918 all over again. And it turned out not to be as deadly as it first appeared. But that woke up the Obama people quite early to, this is a threat that we need to prioritize. And they did. And then they had themselves, after that, in succession, they had several other scares, including the Ebola scare. And what you saw, I think, is why you have transitions. Like Bush people did explain to the Obama people, and the Obama people did listen. And they did keep some Bush people around in case of a pandemic, that this is a threat we need to be prepared for. And this is how we prepared for it. So the Obama people at least had that in their heads. And with when a normal transition, what would have happened is the Obama people would have then explained to the Trump people that, look, this started back in the Bush administration, and we've been building this growing capability to deal with this problem. And this is why you ought to be scared to death of it, because we've had these incidents. And all it takes is a little mutation in a flu virus, and you've got a mess on your hands. So this is why it's all there. But they never heard any of that, the Trump people. And so it was, they did a number of things that as a result of ignorance, but one of them is to remove the pandemic management capability out of the White House, off the National Security Council. So it was kind of like, we're just going to start all over.
Right.
And we're not going to learn. We're not going to have any of the things that were learned by we're not going to internalize any of the things that were learned by the previous administration. And when that happens, I mean, you end up learning all your lessons very painfully, right? All over again. And the great benefit of a transition now, of Trump going to Biden, it's a curious thing now. We have a different sort of problem. It's the outgoing administration now that doesn't want to participate in the transition, not the incoming one. Same people, but they don't want to do it again. 4 years ago, it was a little like the F student had been assigned to go learn from the A student, and the F student decided they didn't need it to learn anything. And now we have kind of the F student's been told they need to teach the A student whatever they know about this course the A student's about to take. And that on the surface maybe seems less frightening because, what do they, if they didn't care about government, what are they going to have to teach anybody coming in to do it? On the other hand, they actually are in possession of a lot of data, a lot of information, and it's a lot of it classified, that the Biden people need to know to understand where they are in the pandemic, where they are in foreign relations, where they are in things like the Iran nuclear deal. And you've seen in the newspaper, and I think it's true, that the Biden people now will say, this isn't a crisis now, that we can go about our business for a little while now without them participating. But at some point, it's going to be a crisis. At some point, we're going to be less good at doing the things we need to do for the American people because we didn't find out what we needed to find out until January the 20th.
Yeah, Biden was saying today that if they don't give us the information we need to coordinate on the COVID task force, then many, many more people could die than have died already. Before we go in more deeply into this.
Can I give you one example?
Yes.
It's a little example, but something I stumbled upon just the other day, and I haven't seen anything written about it. So there's a company called Abbott Labs that has made, I think, 150 million very quick COVID tests. It takes 15 minutes to find out whether you have it. And it's almost like, it looks like a pregnancy test. Mm-hmm. And you can just do it yourself. You stick the swab up your nose. Mm-hmm. Now, the federal government bought them all, the first 150 million. And instead of figuring out what to do with them nationally, like trying to maximize the value of those, like where's the highest leverage situation? Is it so kids can go back to college and they give themselves tests every morning? Is it getting on airplanes? Is it what is it? Where should those be, those tests? Because they work. They actually work. And instead of doing that, they just ship them out willy-nilly to states. Based on, interestingly, they didn't just ship them to the red states, which you might think they would do. They shipped them out based on the population of the states. So like the state of California is sitting on whatever many millions of these tests, unclear about what to do with them. So they're just sitting in a warehouse. Now, all right, the Trump administration does not want to run this pandemic, but the Biden administration does. They need to know about these things. They need to know that those tests are sitting in state warehouses waiting to be deployed. So they can, right now, they could start to build a strategy for what to do to maximize the benefit of us having in our possession 150 million very rapid tests for COVID. And it's a small example, but I think there are probably 1,000 of such things that if they knew about them, they could behave more intelligently the minute they get there. And there's a broader problem, and that is what Trump has exposed it, that we as a society should not be at the mercy of any one president like this.
Right.
That we need to rethink about, I think, the structure of our government a bit. So it's more like a European civil service. And there aren't these 4,000 political appointees who are running everything. And that there's more continuity so that one guy can't cause so much trouble.
Well, some definite changes will be made, things that have been traditions that we didn't really worry about because we couldn't even imagine a Democrat or Republican ever showing such disregard for those traditions will now have to become laws. I think that will happen. That's indisputable, that we know we need to protect ourselves in advance from any madman ever getting in such a position of power again. It is as though Biden is walking down, it's like walking down an aisle, and Trump is just trying to put his leg out in order to trip him up. And of course, that's at our expense. Do you think that by Trump doing this, that he actually feels there's any value in it for him, that it could actually in any way diminish the chances of Biden becoming president? Do you think that Trump at this point really feels that he could overturn the election results?
No. I think he's probably realized that now. But what he can do is delegitimize them in the minds of his most fervent supporters, so that he can continue to pretend like it was stolen. So he can keep his narrative, I never lost.
Right.
That's he just wants to be able to say it.
Right.
Does he believe it? No, I don't think he believes it. But I do think that his impulse to create chaos is related to his willful ignorance. That if you had been elected president, could have happened, or if I'd been elected president, unlikely. My first response would have been a terror about what I didn't know. I would have been being briefed from morning till night about everything I didn't know. And so that's the natural human impulse in that case. And Trump's got this very odd, don't tell me because I already know. But the chaos that he creates, I think the broad thing that's going on is that he feels like he's got a playing field on which he's more likely to win if it's a chaotic playing field rather than an orderly one. And so he's just trying to maximize the amount of chaos because it minimizes the likelihood that people are going to notice just what's going on.
But also there's the issue that the larger philosophical right-wing sort of libertarian idea was that the reason government didn't handle any of these things, didn't need to, was because the private sector could do better. That was the whole Jared Kushner face of the government, that it's almost like we didn't want certain things to work if the government was making them work, because there might be more money to be made if we left it to the private sector. And one of the things that in your book is made so clear is that the private sector and the marketplace has many benefits to it, but long-term planning for risk management of possible scenarios of emergencies, that's not even their job, and that's not what they're there for.
And to the extent that they used to do long-term sort of stuff, they don't as much anymore. I mean, like AT&T used to have this great thing called Bell Labs, and Xerox had Xerox PARC. And corporations used to have more of a capacity to do stuff that wasn't going to pay off in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. The markets have one of the effects the modern markets have had is to create a short-termism. Like,
right,
what's the next quarter going to be? And that's not an environment where companies start to do things for the very long term. And the government, so what it means is that the government becomes an ever more important source of like basic science and basic research and development. And their money that the government is spending there is like the only money that's being spent. And so in a funny way, the government is not, it's more important, because the private sector has abdicated more and more of that responsibility, to the extent ever was really a responsibility. But so yes, and it's a very odd thing, this notion that the market is somehow going to, I don't know, deal with climate change.
Well, it became our bottom line. And like you said, not just profit maximization, but short-term profit maximization. And not only is that unsustainable for government, but I think what you're saying, it's even unsustainable for capitalism ultimately. So one of the things that becomes clear is that our orientation towards government needs to change. I think a lot of people realize after the Trump experience that there are going to have to be some changes. Not only, as you were just saying, in the fact that one man could do this much damage or one woman could do this much damage, but also just in the orientation of the average citizen towards what government's up to. We had such chronic disengagement from the processes of government. We just assumed things were being handled, and they were being handled in the worst possible way. Right now, seeing Biden come in, he's bringing a lot of the old Obama people in. He's bringing a lot of people from his own work. What are some of the changes that you would like to see that don't just represent going back to the way things were even before Trump, but really are a new way that we need to do America and that we need to do government in the days ahead?
I can think of a few things off the top of my head. One is what I said before. I think, like, instead of 4,000 political appointees running the government, it may be 200, and turn many of those political jobs into permanent civil service jobs, so the expertise and the high level management continues from one administration to the other, to the next. I think there are things like like just how people get hired and fired in the government, which is bizarre. It takes 6 months to get anybody hired. It's hard to fire people too. There needs to be kind of basic reform of how the workplace functions. I think one of the biggest things we could do is allow government agencies to promote what they're doing. So people,
I agree with that.
So you get a civics lesson. You get this is what your National Weather Service just did, and when people can see that, it takes a lot of the sting out of the charge the government doesn't do anything.
And there's going to be a lot of Rick Santorum-like resistance to that, because many companies, corporate interests will say, well, if people know how much government is doing for them, they won't feel necessarily that they need us. Right? Right?
Well, there's some truth to that. There's absolutely some truth to that.
Well, absolutely. And so you have 2 million people, around 2 million people working for the government. You know, one of the things that I think opened a lot of people's eyes was a few years ago when the government shut down. And you saw all these stories about people who weren't going to get their paycheck, who were civil servants. And I think a lot of people went, oh, that's who works for the government.
Yeah.
That's who works for the government. I think that with the pandemic, people have realized that a lot of situations that we've been told, you know, this could be a disaster. And people thought, yeah, somebody's watching out for it. There are other areas besides just infectious diseases where people probably will take it more seriously now, that this is very serious and we do need to know that somebody's on top of this. The toxic sludge that's in Washington State, environmental catastrophes, people are seeing more and more, the hideous hurricanes, et cetera. And one that I think really, I know that I'm thinking about it a lot, and I think a lot of people do, has to do with the Iran deal and and the President Trump taking us out of the Iran deal, and the average American not realizing what this really meant. And so now you have Biden wanting to get back into the Iran deal, but Trump refusing to give him information that he needs to know. As you were saying, a lot of it is classified. Where are we exactly? What has happened with those sanctions? What has happened with those maximum pressure sanctions? Rouhani is already saying things. Khomeini is saying things. And Trump basically doesn't know any more than you and I know because we're reading the newspapers. It's extraordinary, the level of irresponsibility that the Trump administration is showing here.
Yeah. So, and the ability and the willingness to take really dramatic action without knowing anything. I mean, pulling out of that deal was pulling out of the most likely scenario for Iran not getting a nuclear weapon. And that's what they did. That's what they did. And what it does in the world when they have one or when they're about to get one is terrifying. And this was a deal that, you know, it wasn't just like Obama, you know, putting his finger in the air and saying, maybe this will work. You know, big time physicists were at the negotiating table, and they knew exactly what Iran needed to get a bomb, and they knew that this deal prevented them from getting a bomb. And instead, now we have a mess, and it's a mess that Biden will have to clean up. But you do need to know what's happened there and what the state of play is. And I assume that like, there's more than one source of information to the Biden transition team, that they're probably prepared for the worst case, that Trump doesn't let the civil service speak to them until January the 20th. But there are a lot of back channels where they can get some information. But why is it this way? I mean, who runs a country this way? If anybody ran a company this way, the company would be bankrupt.
That's the joke here about his being a good businessman. There's no good businessman element here. We do know about the suffering, so much suffering among just average, you know, everyday Iranians because of the so-called maximum pressure campaign. And of course, in his bullying, grandiose way, Trump thought that this would make the Iranians come to the table and make a separate deal with him, which of course they haven't done. Now, today there were announcements about all of the experts that Biden is meeting with, but Trump is still not allowing any of the government agencies or the officials at these agencies to meet with him.
Yeah, so it's important. What people don't realize is that by not allowing the transition to happen, it isn't just that Trump's political people aren't talking to Biden's political people. Is that the entire civil service is forbidden from talking to the Biden transition team. This 2 million person operation they have to run is forbidden from explaining what's going on inside the various organizations.
Right. It's not just a matter of politics. I've said for so long, if there's any public issue, it will make its way to your private door. There's been a way that people just thought that this was something that they call politics. It wasn't real people. That's what your work has done that to me is so extraordinary. It's made us see that these are real people. And these are people that care. And in many cases, you said here on this podcast, and you make such a point in the book, these are not people who make a lot of money. These are people who are there because they really want to make the world a better place. The kid who said, I want to know what made that tree almost kill my grandmother, and I want to grow up and be one of the people that would make sure that my grandmother was kept safe. To humanize our relationship with politics. And that's I think of you, Michael, as kind of like the role of the Greek tragedian in ancient Greece, that they would tell the story that everyone knew. But they would tell the story and all its sort of mythical elements so that people would understand and take it in a different kind of way. Do you feel that that's what you're doing with your podcast? I can't imagine the life you live, because you said you're writing a new book. The book that you're writing now is a sequel to The Fifth Risk.
It's a book about the pandemic. It's a strange book about the pandemic, and it's very character driven. But it is in a way a sequel to The Fifth Risk, because this is the thing that happened.
Right. And I thought about that a lot. When the pandemic started, I thought this is exactly what he was talking about in The Fifth Risk, but it was after The Fifth Risk was published. So when you say it's a story, it's a human story, is it the actual story? I mean, your work is nonfiction.
It's nonfiction, but my God, it reads more like a novel than anything I've ever written.
As does The Fifth Risk. So you're telling the story. I was wondering if you were doing that.
But I do think that, so from the very beginning of my writing career, when I was 27 years old, I wrote a book called Liar's Poker, which was me on Wall Street. What I discovered was that you could take a reader through lots of otherwise boring, seemingly tedious, seemingly really complicated stuff if you could interest them in characters.
Yes.
And there are ways to frame even the thickest material, so that my mother wants to read it, and that's I feel like that's what I've always done. And when I find so the joy for me is finding something that's complicated that's worth trying to get across, and a way to do it. And the government is that. I mean, it might be the biggest challenge, because it's a big hairball, and people think they have no interest in it.
Well, you do it so brilliantly. You bring in, like you said, that element of storytelling. So it's a left brain issue, but it goes over into the right side of the brain. And of course, that's what happened in The Big Short as well. I had told you earlier, it was the scene where he's in Las Vegas talking to, I think it's a woman who had lost, that the whole thing you begin to understand, because I think a lot of these problems, partly because we were not taught civics, but also because I believe a lot of the political establishment fails in its educative function. It doesn't explain things. People are not stupid. I felt this as a candidate. People are not stupid, but the dots have been scrambled. People aren't connecting the dots. And I think that there's a pretty nefarious way in which the political establishment retains a lot of its power by not divulging more of the larger picture about what's happening, which only increases people's disengagement and people's misplaced trust while they're handling it.
Right.
But I think that will be different now. So you're writing a book to explain COVID to us, which is extremely important. What about your podcast? Tell me about your podcast.
Well, it's called Against the Rules, and I've done 2 seasons, and it's the similar sort of thing. It's storytelling around a theme, and the theme the big theme is that the authority figures in American life have been under attack in various ways. And if you look at what's happened to certain authority figures, types, it tells you a lot about what's going on in the society. And the first season, I mean, for an example, I was just looking at referees in American life. And, the government plays a very big refereeing function, right? Regulatory function is a refereeing function. But you can look at what seems like a tiny story and get a lot out of it. So I'll give you one example. The first episode of the first season was just about what's happened in professional basketball to referees. And it's a really interesting story because it's a microcosm of what's happened to referees across the society. You go back 40 years in professional basketball, and half the referees came from one high school in Philadelphia, and they were all kind of like chubby white guys who weren't trained in any particular way. And if you go back and analyze the games they called, they made 10 times more mistakes than the referees do today. The referees today are highly trained. They go through interview processes to get the job. Once they get the job, their mistakes are checked every which way. They are really a professionalized workforce, and you can show they make 1/10 of the mistakes of the old refs. And yet, the refs today are under a kind of assault that the refs 40 years ago were not. They have armed guards to get them out of the arenas back to their hotel rooms. They are, their phone numbers, home phone numbers are all put on the web so fans can harass them. The belief in any particular fan base after a game that the referees somehow screwed them is so much higher than it was back when the referees actually were screwing them. And so we've got this very peculiar relationship to this person. And what is this person supposed to do? This person's job is to maximize fairness, or at least feelings of fairness. And that's what's going on, is that in our society is that it feels unfair. It feels unfair, and people are like on a hair trigger alert to evidence of unfairness, to evidence of things being rigged, even when they're not rigged. So you have this peculiar situation that you could tell through a single story, through the referees of the National Basketball Association, of how even in an environment where everybody is doing their damnedest and doing pretty well to make it a fair game, everyone emerges from it feeling like it was an unfair game. Now, what does that sound like? Sounds like our current election.
That's right. Well, I think it's also true of teachers. I mean, it's just such it's unbelievable today. You get the feeling that students feel more permission to tell the teacher what the teacher is doing wrong than teachers in many situations feel that they have permission to tell the student what the student is doing wrong. It's a misplaced, it's a rage that's legitimate in that so much is rigged in this society, but it's a distraction because our rage is being projected onto the figures that are the ones holding it all together, rather than the ones who are really making it all fall apart.
That's very well put. You should run for office.
Yeah, it was a thought I had at some point. Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I felt that the voters understood everything that you and I are talking about. I felt that voters were eager for information and were far more intelligent than the political establishment gives them credit for. And I think this would be, look at the readership of your books. It's the political system and the political establishment, the political campaign media industrial complex that doesn't want the deeper, more authentic, more noble, and more intelligent conversation to occur. I saw that. I experienced that. And I see that as a real problem. You know what you ought to do sometime, Michael? Not like you need my ideas for what your next book should be. After you do this next one, maybe you'll go on a campaign sometime. Either as a candidate or as a Hunter Thompson type character. It would be fascinating to see if you saw, as I did, as candidates do see, what it's like out there, but particularly the two parallel universes and how divergent they are between this really extraordinary, profound relationship that political candidates and potential political figures have with voters versus this establishment system that has more to do with money and power than it has to do with the promulgation of democracy.
Was it different from what you expected to be going in?
Well, because I've had a 35-year career talking to audiences, I already believed in people. My father was a lawyer, and he used to say, talk to the smartest person on the jury. I already knew I'm very well traveled, not just geographically, but socioeconomically. I have been up close and personal with so many people in the times of their despair and struggle from all walks of life. So I already had a deep faith, belief, trust, and respect for anyone if they're just given the facts. But so if anything, I left there with a greater faith in what democracy can be and even more inspired by it, because even today with the world as it is, I saw how much people aspire to trying to make things right. Mm-hmm. But in terms of my experience of how the system operates, it's far worse than I knew. They don't silence you, but what they do is they make you appear in such a way that the sort of pseudo-intellectual crowd thinks that they're too smart to want to listen to you.
Right. That's interesting.
The last thing you need from me is advice about what you should write about. But I think that some of the inner workings of political campaigns, you're already onto the inner workings of government. This country will be well served if you ever turn your attention to the inner workings of how the political media establishment actually operates. If they ever get Michael Lewis, God help them all. Does that make sense?
I'm going to file that away. I can't promise I'm going to do it, but I'll think about it.
Well, thank you. I'm so grateful to you for having been with me today. And as I've already said, I find I want everybody to read to make sure the fifth risk and anything. And of course, now your podcast as well, Against the Rules. Thank you so much. God bless you, sir. Bye-bye. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I think of Michael Lewis as one of our most important writers and thinkers, and I'm really honored that he came onto the podcast. And now we're going to go to the question and answer time. Ask Marianne. Remember, if you have a question, you can write to me at marianne@castmedia.com. And I'll read now a couple that came in this week. This is from Carol, and she talks about my campaign, and she talks about reading my book, A Politics of Love. Thank you, Carol, for the kind things that you said. And this is what she says. Here is my struggle, my question. I agree 100% with all that you say in your book. We need to do all those things. I was not engaged in politics until 2016. Since then, I marched in the Women's March in D.C., marched and protested in my area several times, speak unapologetically out on my Facebook feeds about injustices, write to my senators and representatives asking them over and over again to do the right things, and of course, I vote. I didn't stop 70 million people from still choosing to vote for a person who represents hate. It didn't stop people in Kentucky from voting an obstructionist as Senate Majority Leader. It didn't stop people from choosing a party who is outright attacking their civil rights and access to health care. I want to see change, but it feels like the forces of darkness are gaining more momentum than the forces of light. And I want to do more, but I don't see how I can. I'm a single mom with 2 boys working a full-time job trying to get my boys graduated and off to college. If money were no object, I would move to D.C. and become a full-time activist and organize and speak publicly and go to Georgia and Kentucky to speak with the people about what they believe and why they vote for corrupt people who lie and cheat and are in courts trying to take away their health care and are coming for their Social Security. But I can't, not now at least. And how many other working people with jobs and families can? The dysfunction in the government, it's so overwhelming. The people who we need to make changes in laws or amendments to our Constitution are the ones least motivated to make those changes because it would mean a loss of their power. The GOP has gone off a cliff, and their strategy is to starve Democratic presidents so that the masses can blame them for not getting anything done so they can convince people to vote Republican. It's become no longer government. It's a game of thrones. So if the apparatus we have to making lasting change is corrupt, if our voting system itself is corrupt and compromised, and people are literally brainwashed by Fox News, what else can we do? Nonviolent protest worked for MLK because it was a novelty in America and it was shocking. Politicians just don't care how many people are in the streets now. I get that protests engage and inspire and motivate the people protesting, but it doesn't seem to move anyone in Congress to make changes or act in the interest of the people they represent. It seems we need a new, more evolved tactical strategy. I hear your ideological call to action. I'm seeing what you're seeing, but I don't see how to get 70 million people to think differently enough to see reality and truth in order to vote the right people in. I heard even AOC might not run next term because she's become weary of the corruptness of the system and is losing faith in her ability to make changes. So I guess my question is, how do we ordinary Americans take it to the next level? Beyond just voting, beyond just saying how we must love, how do we do it exactly? How do we, David, slay the giant of corporate and elite power at a time when their stronghold is so fortified and strong? I'm ready for battle. I feel we all need to do more. I'm willing to organize and speak and fight for love. I just am not seeing how. Thank you for taking time to read my email. You're a true light to me in this dark time. Carol Ann in Safety Harbor, Florida. Well, first of all, thank you, Carol Ann, and I feel you. You know I feel you. I wouldn't have run for office myself. But first of all, I want to say this. We don't want to demonize huge swaths of people. We just don't. It's not helpful, and I don't even think it's true. Remember, a lot of people aren't watching what you're watching. The things that we watch where Trump would say something so racist or say something so hateful or say something so demonizing, our communications today between the way news organizations operate and the way social media operates, you and I are seeing a lot of different things. I think some of the things that I've seen him do, other people who are voting for him and are watching other news programs, they haven't even seen those things. They haven't seen those things reported on. And some of the things that they do see reported on are deeply, deeply questionable in the ways that we look at the world. So that's number one. Number two, there's one thing you didn't talk about, Carolyn, and that to me is the most important thing of all. And that is you getting involved in your community at the local level. You said that you live in Safety Harbor, Florida. Well, in Safety Harbor, Florida, there's a mayor, there's a city council. There are people who actually work for the government on your local level. You talk about how you vote, but there are steps before voting. There are people who are actually handling how things operate politically in your own community and in your own neighborhood. I know you're busy. I know you're raising your children. And I agree with you. Part of what's so wrong in America is that because of the economic stress and anxiety that so many people experience just trying to make it, the last thing they feel they have time, energy, or bandwidth for is actually getting involved in political issues in their local community. That's all the more reason why economic justice matters. But we must try to get involved in at whatever level of political process we can. And that includes in our local community. You have the soul, Carolyn, of more than of just a citizen, although the citizen is the most important job of all. You yourself should think about running for office someday. You yourself should think about it. You know, too many times people on the right wing of the political spectrum, they know that. They pay more attention to local races. Whereas on the left side of the political spectrum, there is a lot of concentration on congressional races. There's a lot of concentration on the presidential, but not necessarily in those local elections and what's going on in our own community. But everything that's going on in the federal government is going on in your local community. So I want you to open your eyes, please, and look at all of the ways in safety. It's at Safety Harbor, all the ways in which your own community is actually experiencing the struggles between forces of justice and forces of injustice. And if you start on your local level, just doing what you have time for, hope is born of participation in hopeful solutions. You know, the problem isn't how many people voted for Trump because it's a free country and people can vote for Trump if they want to. That's their freedom to do so. I believe the deeper problem is how many of those millions of people did not feel that the Democratic Party represented a real alternative. That's why I feel so strongly about things like Medicare for all. That's why I feel so strongly about things like canceling the college debt. That's why I feel so strongly about things like a Green New Deal. Show people what the world could be. That people could actually live a life where they didn't have the stress of worrying what would happen if they got sick or their kids get sick. Think of what the life would be like if you didn't have to worry about those unbelievably heavy debts of college loans. Think of what life would be like if you weren't living under the constant concern that we're not going to be able to handle the catastrophic results of our inaction on climate change. We need to present to the Trump voter a genuine alternative. Sometimes I feel like, obviously, the Republicans don't walk their talk, but the Democrats don't talk their walk. We don't talk enough about the world that we are trying to create. We have to be more than just not the Trump vision. What is our vision? And that's what we have to articulate for people. This is what justice looks like. This is what justice in the criminal justice system would look like. This is what justice in race relations would look like. These are the policies that will change things. These are the policies that will actually make the shift. And those policies begin with things that are happening in your local community. I have done these conferences I did them for a few years called the Sister Giant conferences, where I would urge women to actually run for office. Too many times, people on the left side of the political spectrum leave electoral politics out of their formulation for the things that need to happen in order to change the world. Cynicism is just an excuse for not helping. And I know, Carol, that you're not cynical. You want to know what to do. So that's my advice to you. That's what I submit to you, is that you think about maybe running for something yourself. And I know you might say, no, I just don't have time. But you'd be surprised. Why don't you attend a local community, city council meeting or whatever? Start meeting people in your local community. There might be more of a role there for you than you have any idea. And given the fact that you are so passionate about things, I would bet that there is. Okay, so that's it for today's podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like what you heard, I hope that you will rate and review the podcast on iTunes, and I also hope that you'll check us out on YouTube. Take care of yourself, take care of those you love, take care of your country, take care of your world, and I look forward to when we meet again. Thanks.